Good day, everyone. My name is Chris Mackin. I'm the moderator today of this session, which we are calling ESOPs in Private Equity, the Path Forward. By way of background, I am the founder of Ownership Associates, and after the transaction training and corporate governance firm. I'm a partner with Dick May, who you meet in a minute, of American Working Capital, which is a merchant bank with a long history of financing ESOP transactions of scale. And last but not least, particularly today, I serve as a Ray Carey Fellow at the Rutgers Institute for Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing. My fellowship sponsor, Ray Carey, was the former CEO of ADT, the alarm system company. Ray, who sadly passed away in 2020, was a vigorous champion of employee ownership and friend to Rutgers. So thank you to Ray and thank you to Rutgers. I will introduce our panelists momentarily, but first a brief word about our session. This is the 5th annual gathering that Rutgers has organized on the topic of private equity in employee ownership. There's clearly been progress since our first session. These appear to be promising times for the field in general, and the ESOP segment of the employee ownership space, promising groups such as APIS and Heritage have joined veteran groups such as American Working Capital and Mosaic Capital Partners. Others have also been knocking at the door. Pete Stavros and his colleagues at KKR and Ownership Works have made a significant impact using broad-based equity grants. The October 18, 2022 report of New York State Comptroller Thomas DiNapoli, entitled Employee Ownership of Business in New York State, shows that the stewards of some of the largest collections of capital in our country are paying attention. But before we pop any champagne, I would like to point out that looking through the lens of statistics tracking mergers and acquisitions activity, and with a focus on the ESOP structure, the 200 to 300 annual transactions with a combined value of approximately $20 billion in the ESOP market comprise less than 1% of the roughly 25 to 30,000 M&A transactions with a combined worth of $3 trillion that takes place in the American economy. In other words, we are still the new kid on the block. We are still, as my friend Dick May puts it often, at base camp. Growing this field has always been about cracking the nut of finding the scaled capital that can fill a very obvious gap. That gap is the fact that while they are the people who make American businesses work every day, workers and their counterparts in management, generally speaking, do not have the capital to purchase their firms. Seller financing, a worthy and noble technique that the ESOP world has depended upon for years, helps, but it is not enough. What we need are both new capital sources and a bridge for existing capital sources who are tuning into this session interested in entering the employee ownership marketplace. Public policy can help. Bipartisan federal legislation put ESOPs on the map, first in 1974. Considerable tax advantages that were attached to that law in the mid-'80s and in 1997 helped create a great deal of activity. There are roughly 7,000 companies in the fold, but incentives, while crucial, are not capital. Being less than 1% of M&A volume is not where we want to be. Bold groups like those assembled in this session have made use of the tools available in the present moment and stepped forward with capital, but additional work is needed to fill the gap. In closing, workers and managers without the capital to buy their businesses are not unlike soldiers coming back from World War II without the capital to buy their homes. Before that war, coming out of the Depression, Republican and Democratic leaders agreed on a bipartisan basis that the federal government should signal confidence in those citizens and soldiers by extending credit guarantees to the private markets for home ownership. That choice helped build the middle class. A similarly bold and bipartisan initiative is needed today to recruit the participation of the private sector financial community, and private equity in particular, to help us climb the mountain ahead. We have some ideas about how to do that, and we hope you'll enjoy them in this session. So now let me introduce our panelists for today. First, we've got something on the screen here to show you their pictures. Jack Moriarty is the founder of Ownership America, a 501c3 nonprofit policy organization focused on accelerating the growth of employee ownership. With an MBA from Cornell and a master's in political science from Boston University, he has hit the ground running in helping draft state and federal legislation, as well as to mobilize state-level stakeholders interested in this field, including recent bipartisan legislative victories in California and Massachusetts. Most recently, Jack joined us at the Rutgers Institute for Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing as an Institute Policy Analysis Fellow. Dick May is the founder of American Working Capital. He is one of the pioneers in the ESOP world, with a long history of advising and helping secure financing for lower and middle market privately held companies, including many of the largest ESOP transactions in the country. Operating out of Chicago, New York, and Boston, American Working Capital serves as a general partner in an investment fund with a broad mandate, including ESOP transactions. Todd Leverett is a founding partner of Apis and Heritage Capital Partners, a new $58 million private equity fund committed to closing the racial wealth gap through employee ownership. He comes to Apis and Heritage with a background in finance at JP Morgan and residential real estate, and began his career as an independent business consultant focused on providing value-based financial and operational engineering for small and medium-sized enterprises throughout Detroit. Siobhan Sutton is a senior investment director of Sustainable and Impact Investing Research, a global investment consultancy firm headquartered in Boston, Massachusetts. As a member of the social and impact investing team, Siobhan leads the sourcing and evaluation of sustainability, impact, and manager diversity across all asset classes. Siobhan and the SII team leverage the scale and experience of the Cambridge platform to advance authentic integration of sustainability and impact factors across the investment industry and on behalf of a wide range of pension, foundation, and private clients. Last, but certainly not least, is Jim Sorensen. Jim is the founder of Sorensen Impact Group. He is one of the most influential voices in the world of impact investing worldwide. Jim's early entrepreneurial success with Sorensen Communications and other projects enabled him to build a portfolio that invests in new, inclusive, and innovative platforms. He is a recent enthusiast about the topic of employee ownership, and we are lucky to have him. So we will start with Jack here. I'm going to try to shepherd things along with a question or two for each panelist. And hopefully at the end, we'll have time for a quick discussion. So let's start with you, Jack. Jack, where are the most promising policy opportunities to accelerate the growth of investment in the ESOP field? And how would those opportunities work?
Well, thank you, Chris, and thanks everybody for joining us. My name is Jack Moriarty. I lead Ownership America, a relatively new public policy organization, and we're particularly focused on policy opportunities to mobilize investment into employee ownership transactions. And Chris, you mentioned this at the top of your remarks, but the traditional way that businesses have been financed in sales to employees, whether that's through an ESOP or a worker co-op, has been through substantial seller financing. So that's a situation where the seller is taking back a significant note that's paid out over 5 or 10 years. And that's worked very well for the relatively narrow segment of sellers that have gone in this direction and adopted the employee-owned business model through their business succession planning. But it hasn't appealed to a much larger range of sellers that are looking to fund their retirement with more substantial liquidity. And so when you compare a sale to an ESOP or a co-op or another structure vis-a-vis a private equity buyer, traditional private equity buyer, or a strategic buyer, ESOPs are disadvantaged. They're disadvantaged because they can't provide the liquidity opportunities that other succession alternatives can. And so I think all things being equal, most business owners, after they've built their business, they understand that the workers helped create the value that they're now participating in. They want to leave and preserve a legacy of jobs in their local community. And we know that ESOPs are a very powerful structure to enable that. But until, as a field, we can provide that kind of competitive financing, we will not be able to scale. And I think that's been reflected in not only the stagnation of the growth of ESOPs, but we're actually losing ESOPs year over year. And so this policy question of how we bring new capital sources into the field is very much top of mind for us. I'll mention briefly a couple of existing opportunities that have focused primarily on commercial banks. There's been the 7A program at 7A, at SBA rather, that's focused on guaranteeing individual transactions. There's been an effort several years ago with legislation to bring that program closer to employee ownership, although there's been some challenging implementation related to that. There's also more recently the State Small Business Credit Initiative, which was passed in the American Rescue Plan. It allocated $10 billion to the states to fund their own range of small business credit enhancement programs. And importantly, this version of the program, it was actually a holdover from the financial crisis in 2008, actually enabled these capital funds to be used to buy out selling owners if it was through majority employee ownership. And that was an important stride in bringing employee ownership much closer to the development finance playbook. Those are exciting opportunities, but they're necessary, but not sufficient. And both focus on commercial banks. And I think the question, particularly as we look to scale, is how can we bring subordinated capital sources, really risk capital into transactions. We know that commercial banks will lend into ESOP transactions, certainly scaled transactions. But when you look at the capital structure, it's that shortfall that the sellers are currently financing that we really need to find ways to replace. And so at Ownership America, we've taken a hard look, inspired by an academic paper written by Chris Mackin, Dick May, and Robert Hockett out of Cornell Law School several years ago, that sort of introduced the concept of how can we enable the full faith and credit of the United States to help workers and managers purchase an asset, a business that they wouldn't otherwise been able to do, which is a playbook that we've rolled out on a bipartisan basis, over many years in many different contexts. And in the case of employee ownership, we've looked at a program at SBA already called the Small Business Investment Company Program. And it's a program that licenses private equity funds, provides them with low cost leverage in return for investing in small businesses. What does that do for the funds? Well, the GPs get more capital to deploy, the LPs get enhanced return profile, and the taxpayer gets a very strong return because it's actually doesn't require an appropriation. It operates at what's called zero subsidy cost. And we've been advising congressional offices on both sides of the aisle at opportunities to take that program and actually expand its use cases to include employee ownership and to really look at what would it look like if every seller that put their company up for auction received at least one bid from a private equity fund that was focused on employee ownership. And I think that ability for funds to provide liquidity for sellers, with some credit enhancement at the fund level, it offers a lot of promising opportunity for the field. Chris, I'll stop right there and hand it back to you.
Very good, thank you, Jack. Dick, I'd welcome your response to Jack's comments, given your decades of experience working in this field with new and mature ESOP companies. Do you give us your thoughts?
Sure. Well, thank you everyone for your interest in our panel session on employee ownership and private equity capital. I am a partner of American Working Capital. Chris is one of my partners. We have 4 other partners. That American Working Capital came into existence as far as I know, the first private equity fund was focused on employee ownership as one of its targeted endpoints to not only return market rates of capital to our LP investors, but to create a employee ownership business that would witness the productivity and wealth sharing broadly across its employee base. That experience, which I started in this business 40 years ago, that experience with American Working Capital starting in 2007, and focused on deploying private equity capital into this market, built a understanding and a appreciation for the difficulty that private business owners have in financing a transaction where the employee owners are the owners on a post-transaction basis, realizing, as Jack pointed out, that the preferred method of doing that in 2007, when we formed American Working Capital, was seller financing. I was able to look at and track over a significant period of time, starting actually back before we began our 2007 fund, from 2000 forward, tracking the performance of a broad range of scaled businesses. They all had market capital bases worth approximately $100 million. There were about 36 of them. And what we had either directly established these businesses earlier in our careers, and we had relationships with them. So we tracked how these businesses did on both a return basis and a wealth building basis. What we found from that experience was that these companies managed to meet market rates of return while creating very substantial wealth for the broad base of workers. And they did that basically through both productivity gains, but also through the direct investments that enabled workers to own a substantial interest in the capital appreciation of the business. That experience led to a long relationship with the development and the uptake of ESOPs in the private equity area. One of the things that I noted was that there were certain impediments to other private equity firms participating in this market. And in order to address those elements and to re-accelerate the growth, which had, as Chris pointed out earlier, had really stalled out about 10, 12 years ago, where the number of ESOP companies that were being converted, a number of companies converted into ESOP companies was stagnating. And one of the things that I found through a study I did is one reason was it was the impediment for liquidity, as Jack pointed out, was a major issue. And the other is that some of the iconic companies, a number of companies that we had established as S-Corp ESOPs, were being acquired by private equity funds. And so in talking with the private equity funds, saying, why not continue the ESOP arrangement? And what we found was there are both corporate governance issues and certain concerns on the holding period of their investments in order to realize the kinds of both returns that their LPs were demanding and to produce the kind of productivity and growth in earnings that these alignments between the capital and the workers produced. So all of those inputs came to a moment when, as Jack related, Bob Hockett, myself, and Chris Mackin were thinking about how do we move this market to the next stage. And what we focused on was an SBA program that allows capital incentives for the LPs, supported with government programs, and also constituting a best practices that we wanted to introduce in setting up these ESOP programs. I'm very hopeful that, first of all, there's more and more inquiries along the lines of how do we invest capital and get market rates of return from an impact investing standpoint, and yet produce the kind of secondary effects, and I'll call them primary effects for wealth with the workers. And so I'm very excited at this point in time that there is a broad interest in what we're doing here, and any of you listening to this program and having questions about how these actually work, their corporate governance aspects, the capital aspects, the communication aspects that we've found over the years of working here could be applied in your interest. So thank you again for your interest.
Very good. Thank you, Dick. And now over to Todd. Todd, you're welcome to the club, my friend. You please tell us about Apis and Heritage and how you guys put it together and what you're doing, maybe a little bit about specific transactions you've been up to.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Chris. Hello, everybody. My name is Todd Leverett, co-founding partner of Apis and Heritage Capital Partners. To date, we sponsor one fund, Legacy Fund One, which is a mezzanine debt fund that lives at the intersection of best-in-class private credit in the world of ESOPs and the world of co-ops. And so a term we often use is ESOPerative, but we didn't create that term, but we think it's one that describes what we're doing and what we're trying to achieve. In short, what we do at Legacy Fund One at Apis and Heritage, buy great, small, closely held businesses and turn them into great, small and medium-sized employee-owned firms that, as everybody on this call knows, it really creates a cascade of benefits to workers and to communities. We address the racial wealth gap specifically using this investment model by investing in businesses that have at least a third of their workforce being people of color. We have a 40% floor across our portfolio, and to date, of the two investments that we made at Legacy Fund One, about 75%, more than 75% of the workers in our portfolio are people of color. So our mission and goal was to take these tools that folks at places like American Working Capital, Dick and Chris and team have developed, and Mosaic, and kind of put a spin on them and direct them specifically at workforces of color. So it's an honor to be on the call with you all. Chris and Dick, you remember very, very early on in the process, you all came to DC, sat down and spoke with us and spent time with us. And the time we spent with you has been really integral for our team. Same with the team over at Mosaic, Steve Buchanan and Keith. And so we always say we stand on the shoulders of giants. So just wanted to take a second and acknowledge some of the giants in the room. Without Jim and the Sorensen Impact Foundation, which was our first non-individual investor of the fund, I wouldn't be here today. We wouldn't be here today. So Jim, to you and your team, thank you. And to our compatriot Jack and all the great work you've been doing and all the great wins that you've been achieving for our world. Happy to be here. And Siobhan, we've been on the call before. Good to see you again. So I always have to pay dues and pay respect. So good to be on the line. The reason Apis and Heritage exists because when I was working at the Democracy at Work Institute, DOWI, which is our technical assistance partner on the fund, I was charged specifically with figuring out how we scale employee ownership, specifically for workers of color and owners of color, with the goal of addressing this country's out of control and what I would call immoral racial wealth gap. As everybody knows, the bottom 50% of American households own less than 1% of American wealth, and 60 to 75% of Black and Latinx households have $0 in retirement assets. So again, we're looking to take these tools, direct them at workforces of color, communities of color, and help reverse this growing trend towards wealth inequality and racial wealth inequality in this country. Everybody knows, why do we use ESOPs? Why do we think ESOPs are so powerful? The long legislative history, the large world of banks and financial institutions that have experience with financing these transactions, the great corporate tax environment for employee-owned companies, ESOPs specifically, and they're better businesses. If you bring in the right cultural elements, which is why we partner up with the Democracy at Work Institute, these businesses grow faster, they have better margins, they do better during downturns and better during upturns. So we think when we're addressing the racial wealth gap, using a tool such as ESOPs is valuable and important. I'll talk a little bit about the two transactions that we've had to date. In response to Chris's question, we've invested thus far in two companies, a landscaping company, Accent Landscaping in El Paso, Texas, and Apex Plumbing in Denver, Colorado. Between the two companies, the workers there represent over 200 families. And as stated before, over 75% of the workers in the portfolio are BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, or people of color. So really achieving this goal of taking this model to the places where they're needed the most, we're on track and excited to keep going in that direction. You know, both of these transactions, just to talk exactly about what you all are referring to, the owners of these companies weren't people of color. They were white males who were looking for an exit, and families who were looking for an exit. And we talk a lot about the silver tsunami of the baby boomers who are looking to exit. And we as a team know, and you all know, that we're at a really kind of important time in American history where a lot of assets are changing hands. And we believe using the tools of employee ownership and getting some of those assets in the hands of the folks who deserve it the most, the working class folks who brought us through the pandemic, the essential workers who kept this country going when everything was going south, using this tool to get more assets in the hand, using our financing product to get more assets in their hands, we think is going to create a brighter future for this entire country, and all the workers across the country. So I'm checking my time. I'll stop right there, and so we can keep it moving. Thank you. Very
good. Thank you, Todd. I've got to acknowledge that nice shout out of the dinner with you and Phil was at the ESOP-owned Tabard Inn in DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C. So everybody ought to a little shout out for the Tabard Inn. Okay, let's move over to Siobhan. Siobhan is an impact investment leader that is sitting at the intersection of a range of different asset classes and impact strategies. What stands out to you about the impact potential of employee ownership?
Todd, the future. This is an exciting conversation. I'm so glad to be here. I mean, we all are clear that ESOPs and related strategies are, as a concept, aren't new. They've been around since the 70s or earlier, but the focus by investment firms on this type of strategy is quite new and gaining steam, to Todd's point. He's an example of that, and it's for good reason. He mentioned a number of
Whoops, you just muted yourself accidentally.
Todd just mentioned a number of reasons why it makes a lot of sense. We know about the widening gap between the rich and the poor in the US. We know there's a large and growing private middle market where people are just trying to get out of their business. They're trying to retire. They're trying to exit. I think the last number I saw, where there were like 2 million owners that are looking to retire or exit. And Americans are woefully underprepared for retirement, with some 70% of Americans with less than $1,000 in their savings account. And as Todd mentioned, when you look at BIPOC communities and lower middle income communities, that number is even more stark. And you compare that to the average ESOP balance, which was around $100,000 at my last check. So that's not a small chunk of change for folks who would otherwise not have any retirement savings. At Cambridge, we're looking to help clients to really find new and innovative ways to address problems just like this while achieving attractive risk-adjusted returns. I personally lead our efforts around social and environmental equity investing, and we're building out new human-forward frameworks for investing in a number of social impact themes, including financial inclusion. Right, so PE firms targeting ESOPs as a strategy is of growing interest, and it sits squarely in that sort of financial inclusion peg. And I like to make the distinction between financial inclusion and financial access. Right, when we talk about access, we're talking about creating good jobs, living wages, and the ability to transact, which is great as a step one. But that's not the last step when we're talking about big I impact. Inclusion, on the other hand, is right in this ownership realm, directly targeting wealth generation and wealth inequality. So we like ideas like that. That said, when we talk about ESOPs as an investment strategy, it's very early days for us. We've been spending a lot of time landscaping managers to get a sense of who's out there really doing the work in an intentional, focused way and really facilitating this kind of steward ownership. We see this as a differentiated private equity allocation in client portfolios with really the potential, if done well, to have off the charts mission alignment, right? But the one thing I like to say is for everyone on the line and in general, that ESOPs are no magic wand. They are one tool that we can use. And we at Cambridge remain extremely thoughtful because not all managers and not all strategies are created equally. When we think ownership structures and returns aside, because we know the managers we see tend to do that part really well, it's important to really keep in mind that as financial intermediaries, we have to be careful not to simply reinforce the same inequities we see today, right? And so when I say that, I mean, we risk keeping the status quo when we lack intentionality impact at the strategy level, when we're not establishing the right sticky kinds of policies to serve the underserved and unseen. And I'm thinking of lower income BIPOC communities. When we fail to establish material impact metrics that we measure and track over time, especially at exit, when we fail to acknowledge and address the reasons why people are locked into poverty, and really one passion of mine is failing to combine financial inclusion with financial literacy. So we have to establish the ESOP mechanism with that literacy so that we're giving tools and structures and systems to sustain wealth. So overall, we see employee ownership as a really promising development. When we talk about impact, we talk about financial inclusion, and when done well, Todd put it greatly, there's a lot of positive. And these types of companies are really growing faster. They have higher employee loyalty and engagement, higher productivity, and there's also evidence that they just maintain during down cycles. So for us, that's just a really, really strong and attractive positive impact alongside the market rate returns that we seek for investment ideas on our clients' behalf.
Great. Thank you, Siobhan. So over to Jim Sorensen. Jim, you're a veteran of the impact world. What has intrigued you about this ESOP space? What do you think?
Well, for me, I look for very innovative and potentially transformational models that can address societal problems. A little bit about my background. I was an entrepreneur, an investor for many years, and came to a really amazing experience with one of the companies that I had that initially was focused on the mass market, but because of the dot-com bubble burst, had to pivot to really a much smaller market, that is the deaf community. And the service that I provided was game-changing, that the company provided was game-changing to this community in terms of enabling them to be able to communicate on par with their hearing peers. And it was a very successful financial result. And I realized that you could address a social problem or benefit society in a more scalable, self-sustaining way through a for-profit business model, because you had a cash flow, you could access much larger pools of capital. And that led me onto the path of becoming an impact investor. And that was before that term had been coined. And ever since, I've been looking for ways to deploy capital and facilitate this ecosystem that is needed to enable impact investing in the mainstream. And through my experiences, I learned also that if you collaborated with the government and with other major sectors, that you could really move mountains. I was involved in the Opportunity Zone legislation that really focuses on distressed real estate, and I've been able to see the movement of capital there. And I think that there is a real opportunity here with a combination of the right policy and the access to capital that will enable, I think, one of the major areas of wealth building to be achieved by many, if not most, in the US that are left out. And that would be a great opportunity for impact. So this has really appealed to me. I would also say this, that I've learned that you can generate and beat market rate returns investing in impact if you're thoughtful and you find the right managers like Todd and others. Our foundation is 100% and the corpus invested according to the mission of the foundation. And we're beating the benchmarks. In fact, our private investments are substantially outperforming the public investments this year. And it's young managers like Todd and others that we've really invested in and that are really performing well, that are creating that outperformance. I see the same opportunity and potential for investing in businesses that employ their employees and in this strategy. So that's very attractive to me as an impact investor wanting to generate a very market rate return and beat the returns, while at the same time, addressing what I see as a substantial benefit to society in employee ownership.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jim. I think we've come up against our time limits. You have been listening to a session called ESOPs in Private Equity, The Path Forward. I think you've got a glimpse of that path forward. I want to thank all of our panelists for doing this. And thank you to Rutgers University. And we look forward, some of us will be available to you to answer your questions on Friday. Thank you very much. Jack, thank you for helping organize this.